An elderly woman cared for her paralyzed husband, until one day, suspicious of something. Before continuing this story, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel to continue receiving exciting stories firsthand. The icy wind was blowing hard that winter afternoon in a quiet suburb of Portland, Maine. Abigail Wilson, now 58, slid her thin, wrinkled fingers over the cup of tea that trembled slightly in her hands. The soft scent of chamomile filled the kitchen, but it wasn't enough to calm her restless mind. The routine was already so methodical that she could almost time her movements, preparing the tea, checking the time on the antique wall clock, and then taking the drink to her husband, Thomas, who was waiting patiently for her in his wheelchair in the living room. For 15 years, Abigail had dedicated her life to looking after Thomas after a car accident, which, according to the doctors, left him paralyzed from the waist down. She fed him, changed his clothes, cleaned the house, paid the bills, and even gave up her job in a small library to be his full-time carer. In the eyes of her neighbors and the small-town community, Abigail was the embodiment of devotion and sacrifice. Many commented on her strength and kindness, but few knew of the crushing loneliness she carried in her chest. She also transformed the reading room into a makeshift bedroom to facilitate her mobility and comfort. The single bed was narrow, taking up almost all the space in the room, and there was only a bedside table with a lamp. It was just what Thomas needed, since he spent most of his time in his wheelchair, being taken by Abigail to the yard or the living room during the day. Abigail slept upstairs in the couple's old bedroom, while Thomas stayed in the small first-floor bedroom. She told herself it was for practical reasons. It would be impossible for him to climb the stairs, and she needed a good night's sleep to keep looking after him. But deep down she knew that something other than logistics separated them. The silence that had settled between them over the years was more deafening than any unspoken word. On one particular afternoon, something seemed different. Abigail wasn't sure what it was, but a nagging feeling crept up inside her, as if something was out of place. She picked up the tray with the tea and walked towards the small room downstairs. Before entering, she paused at the door for a moment, watching Thomas. He was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling. "Here's your tea, Thomas," she said with a gentle smile, although her voice carried a slight weariness. He replied with a nod and an almost inaudible murmur. Abigail came in, put her cup on the bedside table and pulled the blanket over her legs. Thomas didn't seem to notice the attention she was paying him, his eyes lost in thoughts he never shared. "Is everything all right?" Abigail asked, her voice soft, but he didn't answer. Abigail sighed and left the room, closing the door carefully. Back in the kitchen, she felt a restlessness she couldn't explain. Since the accident, everything in her life had revolved around Thomas. She had given up her job, meetings with friends, plans to travel, everything. The town admired her for her dedication, but in her heart, Abigail knew that something was missing. That evening, while washing up after dinner, Abigail heard a strange sound coming from downstairs. It was a muffled noise, as if something had been dragged. She stopped, her hands still submerged in the hot, soapy water, and tilted her head to listen better. The house was old, and creaks in the wooden floors were not uncommon, but that sound seemed different. "Thomas!" she called out, her voice hesitant as she wiped her hands on a tea towel. There was no reply. Abigail walked to the bedroom door and opened it slowly. Thomas was lying on the bed, his eyes closed, as if he were fast asleep. She stood there for a moment, watching him. The blanket was neatly draped over him, just as she had left it. Perhaps it was her imagination, she thought. After all, she was tired, and lately her mind seemed to be playing tricks on her. However, the following weeks brought more doubts. Small details began to catch her eye. One night she found Thomas's blanket folded in a different way than she used to. Another time, she noticed that the glass of water he always left on the bedside table was half empty, even though he didn't have the strength to hold it. Abigail tried to push these thoughts away, convincing herself that they were coincidences, but her disquiet grew. The peak of her perplexity came one early morning. Abigail was asleep in her room upstairs when she was woken by a low but distinct sound coming from downstairs. It was the sound of footsteps. There was no doubt about it. She sat up in bed, her heart racing. For a moment she thought it might be a burglar, but the idea seemed absurd. Grabbing her flashlight, she went downstairs in silence. When she reached Thomas's small room, he was lying motionless, exactly as he should be. Abigail looked around, but there was no sign of anyone else in the house. Still, that sound, it was at that moment that Abigail made a decision. The next day during a trip to the market, she asked the young clerk Rachel about security cameras. She said she was worried about animals invading the yard, an explanation that Rachel accepted without question. That night, Abigail installed the camera in Thomas's small bedroom, hiding it on a shelf with old books that he rarely read. Guilt ate away at her as she did this, as if she were betraying his trust, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few days, Abigail avoided watching the recordings. The fear of finding something or finding nothing paralyzed her. But one Friday night, while Thomas slept, she finally decided to check. With trembling hands, she took out the memory card and plugged it into the laptop in the kitchen. The first few hours of recording showed nothing out of the ordinary. Thomas was lying in bed, motionless, as usual. But then, at 2:43 in the morning, something happened. Abigail held her breath as she saw Thomas slowly move one of his legs. Then, with a visible effort, he sat up in bed. Her heart raced. She watched in disbelief as he got up and walked slowly to the bedroom door. He opened it, looked around, and left. Abigail paused the video, her hands shaking. A mixture of anger, fear, and betrayal overwhelmed her. How could this be? For 15 years she had cared for Thomas, believing in his paralysis, sacrificing her life for him. And now, he just walked. She knew she needed answers. That very night, she would face Thomas. But as she prepared for the confrontation, Abigail realized that the truth she was about to discover could change everything forever. Abigail spent the rest of the night in a state of shock, the images from the video replaying incessantly in her mind. Thomas getting up, moving as if nothing was wrong, completely erasing the years in which she had sacrificed everything to look after him. Every detail came back like a blow to the chest. The night she spent awake by his bedside, the doctor's appointments she scheduled, the wheelchair she cleaned religiously. And now, it all seemed like one big lie. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was past 3 in the morning, but the thought of confronting him couldn't wait. Abigail knew that from that moment on, nothing in her life would be the same. Putting a coat over her shoulders to combat the cold in the house, she went downstairs with silent steps. The door to Thomas's small room was ajar, and the light from the lamp still illuminated the space. He was there, lying on the bed, his face serene. Abigail stood in the doorway watching him as if he were a stranger. "Who are you?" she thought, swallowing the lump in her throat. Her breathing was heavy, her eyes burning with anger and pain. Finally she entered the room, the sound of her footsteps waking Thomas. He opened his eyes slowly, confused by her presence there at that hour of the morning. "Abigail, what's wrong? Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice still hoarse from sleep. Abigail felt a chill run down her spine, the calmness in his voice, the confused expression on his face. How could he act so well? How could he pretend so blatantly after everything she had seen? She didn't answer, went back to her room and spent the next few hours lying down, but unable to fall asleep. The clock next to her bed ticked every second with a sound that seemed deafening. When the first lights of morning began to appear, she went downstairs and went about her routine as if nothing had happened. She prepared Thomas's coffee, tidied his room, and tried to stay calm. He didn't seem to notice anything. His expression remained as apathetic and distant as ever. Abigail spent the night restless, thoughts swirling in her mind like a storm that refused to subside. The images from the recordings kept popping into her head. Thomas, moving with ease, the man she had believed to be wheelchair-bound for 15 years, now seemed almost like a stranger. But for some reason that she didn't fully understand, Abigail couldn't bring herself to confront him immediately. Something inside her hesitated, as if she needed more. It wasn't enough just to see through the cold screen of a camera. She needed to be there, to witness it with her own eyes. The mystery was suffocating, a weight that seemed to crush her chest. She knew that the truth was close but still out of reach. The hours dragged by, and dawn came with absolute silence. But sleep never came. Lying in her bed, Abigail tossed and turned, thoughts invading her mind like incessant waves. Her gaze turned to the clock beside her bed. The hands read 1:45. She took a deep breath, feeling a strange determination growing inside her. There was no point in waiting any longer. Throwing the blanket aside, She pulled a coat over her shoulders and walked down the stairs in silence, each step echoing faintly through the sleeping house. She stopped in the hallway that led to Thomas's small bedroom. The door was ajar, as always, and a soft light escaped from the lamp beside the bed, casting soft shadows on the floor. Abigail took a deep breath, trying to calm her heart, which was beating so loudly that it seemed deafening. Leaning against the wall, she remained completely still, her gaze fixed on the door. She wanted to see. He needed to see with his own eyes, without interference, without doubts. The minutes dragged by, each second seeming to stretch on forever. Abigail began to question her decision. Perhaps nothing would happen that night. Perhaps she had imagined things, her mind playing tricks after so many years of fatigue and sacrifice. But then, an almost imperceptible sound came from inside the room. It was faint but distinct, enough to make her heart stop for an instant. Without moving, Abigail peeked through the crack in the door, her body tense, every muscle rigid with anticipation. What she saw made her heart race. Thomas moved his legs slowly, pushing the blanket aside carefully, almost as if he was making sure no one heard him. She felt her breath catch in her throat, unable to look away. He sat down on the bed, his movements flowing with an eerie calm, as if he was used to it. Abigail barely breathed as she watched Thomas sitting on the bed, his feet touching the floor. It was surreal to see something she had never thought possible. For 15 years, she had accepted this supposed paralysis as part of their lives. Now before her eyes, he wasn't the broken man she had dedicated her life to caring for. He was sitting there completely normal, as if everything she believed in was just a play on her reality. The silence was thick, almost deafening. Abigail leaned over slightly to try and see better, but in a moment of carelessness, her elbow touched the wall next to her. It was a tiny sound, but in the stillness of the house it was as loud as an explosion. She froze in place, her eyes wide, her hand immediately covering her mouth. Inside the room, Thomas raised his head abruptly, his body rigid, like an animal sniffing out danger. He looked towards the door, the tension clearly evident on his face. For a moment, Abigail thought he was going to get up and check the hallway, but instead, he quickly lay back down on the bed. With quick, nervous movements, he pulled the blanket over his legs, settling into the immobile position she knew so well. It was an almost automatic reflex, as if it was something he had done before to avoid being discovered. Abigail remained motionless, her heart pounding in her throat. He knew something was wrong. Perhaps the sound had been enough to arouse her suspicion. She realized that she had to get out of there before he decided to leave the room. Taking light, silent steps, she retreated down the corridor and up the stairs. When she reached her bedroom, she closed the door carefully, her heart still racing. She threw herself on the bed, but couldn't relax. Frustration boiled inside her, along with growing anger. The plan to catch him in the act that night had failed, and now it was clear that Thomas was on to something. What if he starts to be more careful? What if he realizes that I know? These thoughts consumed her as she stared at the ceiling, trying to calm the storm in her mind. The next few days were a torment. Abigail knew she had to wait, to be patient. She couldn't rush in and risk scaring him off before she got the full truth. However, the more time passed, the more she began to notice the obvious signs that she had somehow ignored for years. It was as if, now that she knew the truth, her eye was sharper, more attentive to detail. On the first day after the incident in the corridor, Abigail went to Thomas's room to change the sheets on his bed. As usual, he was sitting quietly in his wheelchair, gazing out of the window. She pulled back the sheets, and as she shook out the blanket to fold it, she noticed something. The fabric was more frayed at one end, right at his feet. It was a small detail, but to Abigail, it seemed to shout. Why would his feet wear out the blanket if he couldn't move his legs? She didn't say anything, but the discomfort grew in her chest. That night, while she was washing the dishes, she felt something strange on the floor. She looked down and saw dirt marks near the back door. The problem was that Thomas's wheelchair never got there. She was always the one who locked and unlocked the door, and he never had any reason to go near it. The other day, while cleaning his room, he noticed that the glass of water he always left beside his bed was half empty. He couldn't hold it himself. Abigail knew that. She remembered all the time she had to help him drink water through a straw. But now, it was as if every little detail screamed at her, showing her that something was terribly wrong. And so, day after day, the signs piled up. Abigail began to notice that Thomas's shoes, which were rarely worn, had slightly worn soles. Sometimes the carpet in his room seemed out of place, as if someone had dragged it with their feet. Small details that had once seemed insignificant now took on enormous weight. With each new piece of evidence, Abigail's anger grew. It wasn't just the fact that he could walk, but what it represented. For years she had sacrificed herself completely. She had given up her career, her friends, her ambitions. She had become a prisoner of an exhausting routine, believing that she was doing it out of love, out of duty. But now doubt consumed her. Had it all been necessary, or had she been tricked? Once again, the image of Thomas walking around the house at night returned to her mind, like a recurring nightmare. Anger mixed with pain, creating a knot in her throat. She wanted to confront him, to scream, to demand answers. But she knew it wasn't time yet. She needed to wait. She needed more proof. Meanwhile, Thomas seemed to be acting normally, but Abigail noticed small changes in him too. He was quieter than usual, more cautious. She noticed that he was watching her more closely, as if trying to gauge her reaction. This only irritated her more. He knew he was playing with her. He knew he was hiding something, but he still maintained the facade of a dependent man, unable to take care of himself. Abigail began to plan. She couldn't allow another opportunity to slip away. That night she would watch again, and this time, if she had to stay there until dawn, she would. The mystery could not continue. Every day her patience wore thin, eroded by anger and the pain of feeling cheated. She looked at the clock on the bedside table. It was 10:45. The house was silent except for the faint sound of the wind outside. Abigail took a deep breath, trying to calm down. She knew she would need all her strength to face the night. Once again, doubt and mystery would accompany her, but now there was something else. A fierce determination to discover the truth, to face Thomas, and force him to admit what he had been hiding for so long. The truth was there, at her fingertips. All he had to do was wait for the right opportunity, and this time she wouldn't let anything stand in her way. Abigail was lying on her bed, but her body was tense, and her mind was a constant battle between tiredness and determination. The clock on the nightstand now read 11:15 p.m., and she knew she had to wait a little longer. Thomas always acted out in the early hours of the morning, when he believed she was already asleep. She took a deep breath, trying to control the anxiety in her chest. Every time she thought about everything she had discovered, she felt an unbearable weight. Years of sacrifices, sleepless nights caring for a man she believed couldn't walk. It all seemed so cruel now. Abigail closed her eyes for a moment, but the images of Thomas getting out of bed, walking as if nothing was wrong, returned to her mind like a blow. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the loss of the purpose she had believed she had for 15 years. Abigail had clung to the idea that she was doing something important, something necessary. She had given up on herself, her life, her dreams, to take care of Thomas. And now it all seemed like a lie. The minutes passed slowly. When the clock struck 1:30, Abigail finally got out of bed, moving carefully so as not to make a sound. She put on a coat, grabbed her flashlight, and went downstairs, her light footsteps echoing in the sleeping house. In the hallway, he stopped in front of Thomas's room. The door was ajar again, and the light from the lamp illuminated the room with a soft glow. She leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. Her resolve was firm, but her heart was beating fast, as if she sensed that tonight was going to be different. Inside the room, she heard a slight movement. Abigail felt her body twitch. He was awake. She knew it. She stood there, motionless, waiting. The sound of something moving on the bed reached her ears, and then she saw through the crack in the door. Thomas was pulling the blanket away again, moving his legs carefully. He sat down on the bed, putting his feet on the floor just like the night before. Abigail held her breath, her body tense like a rope about to snap. This time, she couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Thomas stood there for a few seconds, as if listening to the silence in the house, making sure he was alone. Then he stood up. Abigail felt the air escape from her lungs, but she remained still. He took his first steps, moving slowly around the room. He picked something up from the bedside table. It looked like a small notebook, and began to leaf through it. Abigail couldn't see what it was, but the way he looked at it made her heart squeeze. He seemed distant, lost in thought, but at the same time there was something in his expression that she couldn't decipher. He put the notebook back and then walked to the door. Abigail stepped back, taking in the shadow of the corridor as he left the room. She followed him in silence, her steps careful not to make a sound. Thomas seemed oblivious to her presence, moving with the same methodical calm she had seen before. He went into the living room and, to Abigail's surprise, stopped in front of the large window overlooking the yard. He stood there, motionless, looking out into the darkness. Abigail, hiding behind the wall, stared at him, trying to understand. "What are you doing, Thomas? Why are you carrying on with this farce?" She wanted to burst into the room, shout at him, demand answers, but she held back. It wasn't time yet. Thomas stayed there for a few minutes before returning to his room. Abigail followed him again, watching as he lay down on the bed and arranged the blanket over himself, returning to the still position she knew so well. It was as if nothing had happened, as if he were the paralyzed man she had cared for so many years. Abigail went back upstairs, climbing the stairs with steady steps but a heavy heart. She sat on the edge of the bed, her trembling hands resting on her knees. Her head was full of questions, but what was eating her up the most was anger. Anger at Thomas for lying, anger at herself for not realizing it before, anger at the lost years, the sacrificed opportunities, everything she had left behind because of him. The next day, Abigail tried to act as if nothing was happening, but it was getting harder and harder to hide the storm inside her. While preparing breakfast, she noticed that her hands were shaking slightly. Thomas was sitting in his wheelchair in the living room, leafing through a book as he always did. But now his every move seemed fake to Abigail. She could no longer look at him without feeling a lump in her throat. Throughout the day, the signs of his deception seemed more evident than ever. Abigail noticed that the wheels of Thomas's chair were almost clean, without the accumulation of dust that she would expect after he used them around the house. Later, while tidying his room, she found a pair of shoes carefully stored under the bed. The soles were slightly worn, a small detail, but one that screamed out to Abigail. She began to observe everything around her with new eyes. It was as if the truth had always been there, but she had never allowed herself to see it fully. Every little detail, the frayed blanket at her feet, the half-empty glasses, the marks on the floor, was proof of what she already knew, but still refused to accept. Abigail tried to stay calm, but it was as if a volcano was about to erupt inside her. With each new day, the anger grew. What hurt most was not just the lie itself, but what it meant. For all those years she had lived for Thomas, believing that he needed her, that the love they shared justified every sacrifice she made. But now, more and more, she felt used, deceived, as if all the years she had devoted to him had been wasted on a big lie. That evening, Abigail was sitting at the kitchen table, her gaze lost in the cup of tea that was cooling in her hands. She barely heard Thomas's footsteps enter the room, but she sensed his presence before she saw him. He stood in the doorway watching her with a curious expression. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Abigail looked at him for a moment, her chest tight. She wanted to say so many things, to shout at him, to confront him, but she just shook her head and answered, "I'm tired." Thomas nodded slowly and went back into the bedroom. Abigail stood there, tears burning her eyes. She didn't know how much longer she could stand it. The weight of the lie was crushing her, and every day she felt closer to the edge. Night fell heavily on the house, and Abigail felt she could hardly breathe. Her mind was exhausted from so many unanswered questions, but the feeling of betrayal, mixed with the fear of facing the truth, was an almost unbearable weight. Every time she looked at Thomas, she felt a mixture of anger and pain, but at the same time, there was something even deeper that held her back. It was fear. Fear of knowing why. Fear of discovering that the 15 years she had sacrificed for him were not just a lie, but a conscious choice on his part to let her believe it. She spent the night pacing the room, unable to lie down and rest. The decision to confront him, to finally face the truth, terrified her. For years, Abigail had built her identity around being Thomas's carer. He needed her. That justified everything: his sleepless nights, his back pain, the friends who had drifted away, the dreams she had buried. But now, if he didn't need her, What was left? Who was she anyway? The hours seemed to drag on. When the clock struck 1:30, Abigail finally plucked up the courage. She put on a light jacket and went downstairs with her heart racing. There was no turning back. She had to face what she knew was coming. She stopped in the hallway in the same place she had been the previous nights and waited. The silence of the house was almost oppressive, but she could hear the familiar sounds of Thomas's room, the soft creak of the bed, a slight movement, and then the inevitable sound of his feet touching the floor. Abigail felt her whole body go limp. He was doing it again. As before, he pulled back the blanket, sat on the edge of the bed and stayed there, listening, waiting. Abigail knew he did this to make sure she wasn't around, but this time she wouldn't hide. She wouldn't wait any longer. With an impetus that seemed to spring from her pain and anger, Abigail pushed the door open with force. Thomas, taken by surprise, froze. He was on his feet, completely exposed, with no time to make excuses or go back to bed. His eyes went wide, and for a moment, he didn't seem to know what to do or say. "So that's it?" Abigail began, her voice broken but filled with a restrained anger that seemed about to explode. "This is how you thank me for the last 15 years of my life." Thomas took a step back, as if the weight of her words were physical. "Abigail, No!" she screamed, interrupting him, tears starting to run down her face. "Don't tell me anything. I don't want to hear your excuses. I want to know, how long have you been doing this? How long have you been able to walk?" Thomas tried to speak again, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. He opened and closed his mouth a few times, as if trying to find something to say, but the silence between them was deafening. "Don't look at me like that," Abigail continued, her voice breaking. "Don't look at me like I'm the victim here, because I know, Thomas. I saw you. I saw you walking around the house while I was asleep. I saw you living a lie while I sacrificed everything for you." Thomas finally managed to mutter something, his voice low and full of guilt. "Abigail, listen to me, please." "Listen to what?" she retorted, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Do you want me to listen to your excuses? Tell me you didn't know how to tell me. That you were afraid? I don't want to hear any of that." She took a step back, her eyes fixed on him, trying to decipher the man in front of her. He seemed so small, so vulnerable, but that only irritated her even more. It was all a facade. He was no longer the fragile, dependent man she had believed she was looking after. "You stole me, Thomas," Abigail said, her voice now low but full of pain. "You stole my years. You stole my dreams. You let me believe that my life had a purpose, and now I find out that it was all a lie." Thomas, his shoulders slumped and his eyes watering, tried to get closer, but she backed away again. "Don't you dare," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Don't you dare try to justify it." Without saying another word, Abigail turned and left the room, climbing the stairs with quick steps. When she reached her room, she closed the door tightly and leaned against it, the tears finally falling. It was as if a dam had broken inside her. Abigail slid to the floor, hugging her knees as she sobbed. The pain was almost physical, a wound that seemed impossible to heal. She barely slept that night. When the sun finally began to rise, Abigail was sitting up in bed, her eyes swollen and her mind numb. The familiar sound of Thomas's morning routine echoed through the house, the wheelchair moving, the bathroom door opening and closing. She heard it all, but didn't get up. It wasn't like before. Nothing was like it used to be. That day, Abigail didn't prepare breakfast. She didn't go to his room to help him. She simply ignored the demands of the routine she had followed religiously for so many years. Thomas called her once or twice, but she pretended not to hear. She put on a coat and left the house, leaving him alone for the first time in years. As she walked through the cold city streets, Abigail felt a strange mixture of freedom and emptiness. For years, she had defined herself by caring for Thomas, and now that this responsibility no longer existed, now that she knew he didn't need her, the question that haunted her most was, who am I? She spent the day walking aimlessly. She went into a cafe and ordered a hot drink, but didn't bother to drink it. She sat on a bench in the park, watching the dry leaves being carried by the wind. The cold cut her face, but she didn't care. All she could think about was how her life seemed like a bottomless pit now. When she finally got home, it was late at night. The house was dark, and Thomas was in the same place, in the living room, this time sitting on the sofa, his wheelchair closed and standing by the window. He looked at her when she came in, but didn't say anything. Neither did Abigail. She went upstairs without saying a word, completely ignoring his presence. Closing the bedroom door, she lay down on the bed, but the weight of the pain in her chest was unbearable. The tears came again, silent but incessant, and for the first time, she wondered if she would ever be able to forgive him. The silence of the house, which had once been a comfort, now seemed to scream. What had been built over so many years was in ruins, and Abigail knew that what came next would be even more difficult. The next day dawned as grey as Abigail's mood. The silence in the house was piercing, but she didn't rush to break it. For the first time in years, there was no obligation that moved her. There was no coffee to make, medicine to sort, or clothes to fold. The weight of habit was still there, trying to push her into the role she had played for so long, but she fought against it. She lay in bed for a few more minutes, staring at the ceiling, feeling the emptiness, the mourning for everything she thought was true, and which was now just a big lie. When she finally got up, Abigail didn't go to Thomas's room. She didn't go to check if he was all right or ask if he needed anything. Instead, she went to the kitchen where she made herself a cup of coffee. She sat at the table with the hot cup in her hands, her eyes fixed on the window, watching the dry leaves swirling in the wind. The bitterness was still there, but there was something else. Something like an idea. She couldn't go on living like that. She knew that. The Abigail that existed before Thomas needed to come back to life. But that woman seemed so distant now, almost unrecognizable. Still, Abigail felt she had to try. Not for him, not to prove anything to anyone, but for herself. After getting ready, she grabbed her coat and left the house without saying anything to Thomas. He saw her pass through the living room, sitting on the sofa with a cup of tea in her hand that he had made himself, but he didn't say anything. He didn't try to talk to her, didn't ask where she was going. Perhaps he knew that words would be useless now. The walk to the city center was long, but Abigail needed that time alone. As the streets passed around her, she tried to remember who she was before her life was consumed by the role of caregiver. She had been young, full of dreams. She had loved books, art, music. But where did it all end up? Where did she lose her way? Without realizing it, her steps led her to a small building with a simple facade. The sign read, Community Art Studio. Abigail stood there for a moment, hesitating. She vaguely remembered how much she liked art when she was younger. It wasn't something she was particularly good at, but it made her happy. Painting, molding, creating something from scratch. There was a freedom to it that she always admired. Before she could change her mind, Abigail entered the building. The smell of clay and paint immediately hit her, awakening a dormant memory of simpler times. An older woman with glasses hanging around her neck on a gold chain approached with a warm smile. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her tone warm. Abigail hesitated for a moment, but finally answered, feeling her voice waver. I'd like to sign up for a class." The woman smiled even more, as if she realized how important this was to Abigail. "Of course, we have pottery classes going on now, if you'd like to start." Abigail nodded, feeling her heart race. It was a small thing, but it was the first step she had taken for herself in many, many years. That afternoon, she sat in front of a pottery wheel for the first time. The instructor showed her how to get her hands into the clay, how to shape it slowly, patiently. At first, Abigail was tense, her hands trembling, as if she was afraid of ruining everything. But as the clay began to take shape under her fingers, she felt something open up inside her. The soft sound of the wheel turning, the texture of the clay against her hands. It all seemed so far away from the pain and chaos she experienced at home. It was a space just for her, where the weight of the past seemed less overwhelming. She created something simple in that first class, a small, irregular vase, imperfect, but deeply her own. When she returned home that evening, Thomas was still in the room. He watched her as she entered, but didn't say anything. Neither did Abigail. She just went upstairs to her room, holding the still fresh vase in her hands as if it were a secret she couldn't touch. Over the next few days, Abigail began to change her routine. She no longer spent every morning looking after Thomas. Instead, she left the house early and went to the studio, where she spent hours molding, creating, and little by little, rediscovering herself. Each piece she made seemed to carry a little of her pain, a little of her anger, but also a little of her hope. The first vases were simple, almost clumsy, but Abigail didn't care. It was the process that mattered. Over time, she began to experiment more, creating small sculptures, abstract shapes that seemed to reflect the chaos inside her. Each time she put her hands in the clay, she felt a little of her heart heal. Thomas seemed to notice the change, but did nothing to stop it. He continued to sit in the room, quiet, as if he was waiting for something, perhaps waiting for Abigail to come back to him, to forgive him. But she couldn't. Not yet. One afternoon, while shaping a piece in the studio, Abigail realized she was crying. The tears flowed silently down her face, mixing with the clay in her hands. She didn't know why she was crying. Perhaps it was the freedom she was finally feeling. Maybe it was the pain of realizing how much she had lost over the years, or maybe it was the emptiness that still lived inside her, a space that Thomas had left and that she didn't know how to fill. The instructor saw her crying but didn't say anything. He just put a gentle hand on her shoulder and went back to work. It was as if everyone there understood that art was a refuge, a place to put the broken parts of oneself. As the weeks went by, Abigail began to feel different. The pain was still there, but it didn't seem so unbearable. There was something new growing inside her, something she hadn't felt for a long time: pride. Not for the pieces she was making, but for the simple fact that she was trying. For the first time in years, she was doing something for herself, and that was liberating. One evening, while she was in her room looking at her creations, Abigail heard a sound coming from the hallway. It was Thomas coming up the stairs. She froze, her heart racing. He never went upstairs. It was as if that space was hers alone, a territory he didn't dare invade. But now he was there, standing in the doorway, looking at her. "What do you want, Thomas?" Abigail asked, her voice firm but without anger. He hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. "I just wanted to know if everything was all right with you." Abigail laughed, but there was no humor in her laughter. "Do you care if I'm all right now? After everything?" Thomas lowered his head, looking defeated. "I know I made a mistake, and I know there's probably nothing I can say to change how you feel, but I see you, Abigail, and I'm sorry." The words hung in the air between them, but Abigail didn't respond. Instead, she turned her gaze to the sculptures in front of her. She didn't know if she was ready to forgive him, but she did know one thing: she was finally finding herself, and that was more important than anything Thomas could say. That night was unlike any other. After weeks of silence, distance, and shared pain, Abigail finally felt that something had to be done. The weight she was carrying could no longer suffocate her. Thomas, despite his betrayal, was no stranger to her. Not completely. He was the man she had loved, the man with whom she had shared dreams and hopes before everything fell apart. And even though the hurt ran deep, Abigail knew she had to face the truth in full. Thomas looked more fragile than ever that night. He was sitting there in her room that had once been theirs, his hands resting on the arms of the armchair, his eyes downcast. Abigail stood silently for a few moments. He looked up slowly. "Okay, so we're finally going to talk," she said, her voice firm, but without the accusatory tone that had accompanied her over the last few weeks. Thomas nodded and motioned for her to sit down too. Abigail hesitated for a moment, but finally gave in, sitting on the edge of the upholstery, as if she wanted to keep a certain distance. "I don't know where to start," he began, his voice low, hesitant. "I don't think anything I say will justify what I did, but you deserve to hear the truth, the whole truth." Abigail crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on him. She didn't interrupt. She wasn't there to ease his guilt, but to understand. Before the accident, that morning. "Do you remember what we discussed?" Thomas asked, his voice almost a whisper. She did. How could she forget? The day of the accident was etched in her memory, a before and after milestone in her life. That morning, they had discussed children. Abigail really wanted to be a mother. She always had. It was a dream she'd had since she was young. But Thomas had never shared this desire. He always avoided the subject, changed the conversation, looked away. "I remember," Abigail replied, her voice rough. Thomas took a deep breath, squeezing the arms of the armchair tightly. "I never told you this, but my fear of having children wasn't just because I didn't want to. It's because I couldn't. I couldn't imagine being a father." He paused, his eyes watering. "When I was a child, my parents, they weren't good people, Abigail. My father was violent. My mother was absent. I would spend hours alone, hiding in my room, listening to screams, trying not to be noticed. And when I couldn't, it was worse. I grew up thinking that being a father meant being like him, that I would end up becoming like him. Abigail felt her chest tighten. She had never known that. In all the years of marriage, Thomas had never mentioned his childhood in such detail. I thought that if we had children, I would fail them, just like my parents failed me. And the fear, it was paralyzing. He lowered his head, the guilt evident in his expression. That morning when we fought, I was lost. I knew how much you wanted a child, and I couldn't give it to you. Not just because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid of repeating the same mistakes, afraid of letting you down. Abigail felt tears fill her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She was listening, absorbing every word, trying to understand what he was saying. And then the accident happened. Thomas continued, his voice breaking. At first I really couldn't move. The diagnosis was real. I was paralyzed. But over time I started to feel little things. First it was tingling, then weak movements. I realized I was getting better, but I kept letting time pass. He paused as if trying to gather the strength to continue. I didn't know how to tell you, and above all, I didn't want you to think then that we could have a child. I didn't know how to face you after everything. You were already so devoted, so present that I felt even guiltier. I thought that if I told you, you'd hate me for not telling you sooner. Abigail finally broke the silence, her voice trembling with pain and anger. So you let me live a lie? You let me sacrifice everything while you pretended you needed me? Thomas closed his eyes, pain showing on his face. I know I made a mistake. I know there's no excuse for it. But every night I thought about telling you. I thought about getting up and showing you that I could walk. But fear was stronger. I didn't know how to face what was coming next. Abigail took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell him how much she hated him for what he had done. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore what she was hearing. For the first time, Thomas was being honest. For the first time, he was showing what was inside him, the traumas that had led him to this point. You destroyed me, Thomas, she finally said. You destroyed the woman I was, but I don't want to carry this hatred forever. Thomas's eyes filled with tears, but he said nothing. He knew he had no right to ask for forgiveness, not at that moment. That conversation was the start of something. Not immediate forgiveness, but understanding. Abigail began to see Thomas not as the man who had betrayed her trust, but as someone broken, fighting demons he had never had the courage to face. It didn't erase the pain he had caused, but it gave her a reason to try. In the months that followed, the two began to rebuild a new dynamic. Abigail, for the first time, put herself first. She continued to visit the studio, creating pieces that were now bolder, more complex. It was as if each new sculpture was a piece of herself that was being rebuilt. Thomas, on the other hand, began to take responsibility for his mistakes. He insisted on helping with the housework, even if Abigail still found it hard to trust him. He started seeing a therapist, something he had never imagined doing but knew was necessary to face his traumas. One day, Abigail came home after an afternoon at the workshop and found Thomas in the garage. He was sweaty, his hands covered in paint and sawdust. "What are you doing?" she asked, confused. Thomas turned around, a shy smile on his lips. "It's a surprise." Over the next few weeks, he devoted himself to the project, refusing to tell her what he was doing. Abigail, still suspicious, tried not to care, but curiosity was inevitable. Then, one day, he took her to the garage and opened the door. The space had been completely transformed. Wooden benches, shelves full of ceramic tools, paints, brushes, and clay pots occupied the space. In the center, a brand new pottery wheel was ready to be used. "I know this doesn't erase what I've done," said Thomas, his voice low. "But I wanted to do something for you. Something to show how much I admire what you're doing." Abigail stood there, staring into space. The tears finally fell, but this time they weren't just tears of pain. There was something else, a thread of hope. The studio had become Abigail's refuge, a space where she could create freely, where she could find parts of herself that she thought she had lost. Thomas wasn't the same man, and Abigail wasn't the same woman either. But somehow, they were learning to coexist. The days in the small house, now transformed by the sincerity and effort of both of them, began to pass more lightly. Abigail and Thomas never went back to the way they were before, but perhaps that was a good thing. The cracks in their lives together had left permanent marks, but they also made room for something new. A relationship based on respect and honesty, even if imperfect. Abigail continued to dedicate herself to ceramics, transforming the garage Thomas had set up for her into a real studio for creating and learning. At first, she used the space only to work on her pieces and expose the emotions she was still carrying around. It was therapeutic, a space where she could reconnect with who she was and rediscover the pleasure of creating. But over time, something unexpected began to happen. Neighborhood children, curious about the movement in the house, began to appear in the yard. At first, they watched through the garage window, enchanted by the shapes Abigail molded in the clay and the vibrant colors of the paints she used to finish her pieces. Thomas was the one who first suggested it. "Why don't you invite them to learn with you? I'm sure they'd love it." Abigail hesitated. For many years, she had carried the emptiness of not having children, and now her relationship with children was something that still made her feel a subtle pain. But Thomas insisted, and finally she gave in. That week, Abigail opened the doors of her studio to the neighborhood children. At first there were only 2 or 3, shy and curious, but soon the number grew. She started offering simple pottery and clay modeling classes. The children loved putting their hands in the damp clay, molding clumsy shapes, and giving free rein to their imagination. The studio, once a quiet refuge, became a space full of laughter, voices, and life. Abigail found a new joy in teaching. Each piece created by the children was unique, full of stories and meaning. More than that, Abigail felt she was helping to shape something beautiful in their lives, something that might inspire them in the future. Thomas, for his part, found ways to remain present and useful. He made a point of preparing the space for the classes, cleaning the tables, arranging the materials, and occasionally helping the children carry their pieces to the ceramics kiln. Even though Abigail continued to prioritize her independence, she saw Thomas's small gestures as a way for him to show how much he wanted to make amends. He knew he could never erase the years of lies, but he made a point of trying every day to show her that he was sorry. At the end of each afternoon, when the children had left, Thomas and Abigail would sit together on the small bench in the backyard, watching the sunset that painted the Canadian sky in shades of gold and pink. There was no need for many words. They shared that moment in silence, each immersed in their own thoughts but somehow connected. There were difficult days, of course, moments when the hurt still resurfaced, when Abigail caught herself reminiscing about the years of sacrifice, or when Thomas was consumed by the guilt of having let it happen. But in those moments, they both learned to deal with the pain without letting it define them. Abigail especially found in art a place to process her emotions. Her pieces began to be recognized not only by children and neighbors, but also by other people in the city. She began to exhibit her work at local fairs, and Thomas often accompanied her, helping to assemble the pieces and organize them in the space. It was the kind of silent support he now knew how to offer, without invading, but always present. The house, which had once seemed a place of solitude, was now a vibrant place full of life. In addition to the children, the neighbors began to visit more often, curious about the studio and Abigail's projects. She, who used to isolate herself in her pain, now smiled more, finding pleasure in sharing what she knew. Over time, Abigail realized that although she had never had children, life had given her something just as valuable, the opportunity to touch other people's lives. The children at the workshop saw her as a kind of mentor, and many of them even started giving her small pieces made by their own hands. For Abigail, that was more than enough. Thomas, on the other hand, found his own peace in seeing her happy again. He knew that he would never completely regain Abigail's trust, but he accepted that as part of the process. He supported her in silence, always willing to do whatever it took to help her grow and thrive. On a particularly cold day, as the snow fell softly outside, Abigail was finishing a special piece in the studio. It was a sculpture of 2 figures, abstract but somehow connected, symbolizing the relationship she and Thomas had rebuilt. Thomas entered the space holding 2 cups of hot chocolate. He placed one of them next to her and looked at the sculpture. "It's beautiful," he said with a soft smile. Abigail looked at him, for the first time feeling something approaching forgiveness. It wasn't complete, but it was real. "Thank you," she replied, picking up the cup. And so, between the sound of the children's laughter, the gentle noise of the ceramic wheel turning, and the silent gestures of love and repentance, they found a new kind of peace. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. But in the cold Canadian landscape, between the wind and the snow, Abigail discovered that starting over was not about erasing the past, but about learning to live with it, finding beauty even in the most painful parts. She had rediscovered herself, and somehow so had Thomas. Together they rebuilt their lives, transforming wounds into strength and pain into a more mature, truer love. And so they lived. What did you think of the ending of this story? Did you enjoy Abigail and Thomas's journey of overcoming and starting over? Let me know what you think in the comments, as it means a lot to me. If you liked this video, don't forget to leave your like to support my work and allow me to continue bringing stories like this to you. Also, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss out on any of the upcoming content. And now, take the opportunity to watch the next video that pops up on your screen. I'm sure it will be just as exciting as this one. See you there.